West Point, home of the United States Military Academy. For almost 200 years, the imposing fortress on the Hudson River has been witness to the staging of ancient rituals. The significance of parade ground formation goes beyond pageantry and precision. Formation signifies control, the means through which military force is effectively brought to bear on the enemy.
Command and control has been with us forever. The American public discovered it on their television sets when they watched Desert Storm. But the principles are timeless and universal. Every military commander since the dawn of time has struggled with coping with uncertainty. They've all asked the same question. What's going on the battlefield? What does it mean? And what should I do about it? Victory usually came to the commander who answered those questions the first.
The ancient Greeks struggled with the basic elements of command and control: organization, weapon technology, and communication. They learned to fight in a close formation, the phalanx. The commander was in the thick of battle. His presence could be decisive as a motivating factor, but there was no way of controlling force once opposing armies were pushing shield to shield.
The phalanx, in order to be effective, had to be shoulder-to-shouldered men with shields and spears, and had to move in unison and had to be well drilled. So they could only move as fast as the soldiers could move, and they were a big, huge body that was hard to turn right and left. That was a very centralized style of command. The Romans, on the other hand, developed a less centralized style. Their organization was a formation that involved smaller units in smaller squares, which was more maneuverable and led by an officer who would be then directed by the general to move and achieve different objectives on the battlefield. So what you see even in ancient times is a battle between centralized and decentralized control.
During the 1,000 years following the fall of Rome, the organization and professionalism of armies declined. Innumerable weapons and tactics were introduced, but it took the development of portable firearms and the growth of large standing armies to reacquire a level of organization and discipline equal to the Roman legions. By the mid-18th century, conditions were set for a revolution in strategy and the conduct of war. The instrument of change would be a young artillery officer from Corsica.
What Napoleon found himself in was a military machine that the French Revolution had produced, which was really superior to most of the military machines on the European continent.
Napoleon applied tactical doctrine in ways never before imagined. To an army 150,000 strong, organized into 8-numbered corps. Each corps operated independently, yet all were expected to respond to a single grand design.
Time and time again, Napoleon was able to move quickly, outmarch his enemies, mass forces where the enemy didn't think that he could mass as quickly, and then beat his enemy either through surprise, superior numbers, or superior generalship.
Napoleon's victories were not won by superior technology, but by superior organization and doctrine.
The ability to see the enemy, make a mistake, and then have the agility to capitalize on that mistake. And one of the reasons he was able to do that was because his organization was flexible enough and had well trained enough to be able to respond to his will.
From Napoleon onward, the growth of mass armies accelerated, but organization and tactics failed to keep up with new technology. The carnage of the American Civil War was the grim result. The first to actually grasp the implications of the new technology on command and tactics was the Prussian general Helmuth von Moltke.
The Prussians had studied how the Americans had used the telegraph in the American Civil War. So what you saw was a revolution in command and control, an ability to move forces quickly by a railroad, and then an ability to communicate with field commanders long distances by means other than messenger, by means of electronic means, the telegraph.
Fundamental to the Prussian command system was the acceptance of confusion or friction on the battlefield. Von Moltke's answer was control, but to delegate it.
There was an old saying in the German army that said, you must be smart enough to know when to disobey orders. And that was the concept of decentralized tactics, that you had thinking, well-trained officers.
This distinctly Prussian concept would provide the operational foundation for future German armies, with near disastrous results for Allied forces in 2 world wars. In the 40 years following the Franco-Prussian War, industrialization and the quest for military supremacy fueled an arms race between the great powers. The study of war was caught up in the scientific spirit of the age. It was reduced to a system of inflexible formulas and tables that resembled the schedules of trains the armies depended on for mobilization. By 1914, it was believed that war could be planned and controlled. Von Moltke's earlier warning that strategy was merely a system of expedience was neglected or forgotten. When war did break out in August, the opening months were marked by great confusion. Peacetime plans and timetables were all but forgotten in an orgy of disorganized bloodletting. The lethality of the machine gun and quick-firing artillery took their toll. In the first 3 months of the war, the combatants had suffered over 1.5 million casualties. By early November, defensive trenches had appeared, and the fighting ground to a muddy stalemate. A vast network of headquarters spread behind the front, linked by thousands of miles of telegraph and telephone lines.
World War I was an electronic revolution in warfare. It was the first time that on a massive scale, armies used radios, used field wire telephone, used telegraph, used all sorts of electronic means to communicate. All of these devices had been used one time or another in battles in the past, but they'd never been used on the scale and to the great degree that they were in World War I for the first time. The use of electronic means had a great impact on how the tactics were fought in World War I because it moved the leadership farther and farther away from the effects of battle.
Although superior to anything used before, wired communications were still vulnerable to artillery and sabotage. With radio still in its infancy, practical mobile communications were non-existent.
In World War I, commanders found themselves captive of their command and control system because it was a telegraph or a telephone wire. It terminated in the command post, and the commander was a prisoner of his command and control system.
Each side, wanting to maintain positive control, restricted operations to the limits of the wire. The British feared confusion and uncertainty. Thousands of their new volunteers, Kitchener's armies, were thought incapable of following anything but the most rigid instructions. This fear dictated British tactics during the Battle of Somme in July 1916 in what was planned to be the Allies' big push. The British Commander-in-Chief, Douglas Haig, conceived a plan so infinitely detailed as to banish anything resembling confusion from the battlefield. "Every step in my plan," Haig announced, "has been taken with the divine help." On July 1, following an intense artillery barrage, the finest military machine ever assembled by the British Empire went over the top. 18 divisions, 400,000 men, 100,000 horses. The British battalions marched shoulder to shoulder, Napoleonic style. General Haig waited by the telephone. The Germans were also waiting. In the first day, German machine guns had accounted for 20,000 British dead.
The differences between the British system and the German system are very apparent when you look at World War I. General Haig, for instance, tried to apply a firepower solution. He would try to plaster the enemy with tons of artillery and then send his soldiers forward to break through. So he penetrated in a very direct sense. You needed a centralized system in order to apply all the firepower and go for a direct assault.
The Battle of the Somme continued for 5 months at a cost of 420,000 men. The British advanced 8 miles. The Somme offensive stands in stark contrast to what the Germans accomplished in March 1918. With the Americans arriving in increased numbers, the Germans needed a breakthrough before Pershing's forces could make a significant difference. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Ludendorff, sought a tactical solution. He understood that offensive operations could not be tightly controlled from higher headquarters. Flexibility was the key. Commanders were positioned at the front lines with their troops. The offensive relied on the initiative of these commanders to keep up the momentum. It was called infiltration.
The Germans tried to find a way to break through the trench lines, and they found their solution by decentralizing their command and control and allowing small groups of well-trained soldiers, the storm troops, to break through and cause a penetration by infiltration.
The Germans penetrated 40 miles in 15 days. No such gains had been achieved in the war since 1914.
The Germans never had the mobility to really exploit their penetrations of the enemy lines. They could make a penetration, and they did this in several battles in 1918, where they were able to disrupt the British and the French lines, but they didn't have the mobility in the form that they would have of tanks in the 1940s to exploit the penetration.
Machine-age warfare had risen to a level of violent efficiency that shattered previously held concepts. It profoundly affected all who survived its deadly swath. Among those was a decorated corporal in the German army, an infantry battalion runner named Adolf Hitler.
Command and control will continue in a moment here on A&E.
The German divisions that rolled through Poland and France in 1939 and 1940 covered in an hour what it took Napoleon's Corps a day to accomplish. But in organizational terms, the two had much in common. Panzer forces, like their 19th century predecessors, maneuvered independently to later converge and overwhelm the enemy. Both exploited superiority in command and control. After World War I, Britain, France, and Russia experimented with massed formations of tanks as a means of breaking the murderous cycle of attrition on the battlefield. Elaborate and grandiose schemes were espoused, but it was a German who formulated comprehensive strategy and tactics for mechanized warfare. Heinz Guderian had been a signal officer in 1914 and fully understood communications. The development of FM radio in the 1930s provided a virtually static-free medium. This was the technical breakthrough Guderian needed to bring his concept of Stoßkraft, or dynamic punch, to reality.
When you think about the masses of German troops rolling across the countryside on wheeled and tracked vehicles, you're impressed with their speed and their mobility. But that's not what made them effective. What made them effective was radios. The wireless had been placed in every vehicle. And so a commander of those forces was not tied to his command post. He could be up forward in a tank or a tracked vehicle, observing what was happening.
You cannot execute and have an effective blitzkrieg, an effective lightning war, without commanders who fight forward, commanders who are forward at the point of decision, who can make decisions when they see the enemy makes mistakes. Unless you had a very flexible means of communications, your command and control would fall apart, and you'd have people moving in all sorts of different directions, because the situation changes so rapidly that you'd have to get together at some point to confer and find out what was going on. The French could not develop plans fast enough to counter the German moves, and even when they did, they were usually disorganized and not coordinated with other forces that were available.
From his radio-equipped command car traveling with the lead column of tanks, Guderian set the pace, becoming the first Corps commander to so lead mechanized forces. His exhausted troops nicknamed him Hurry Heinz. So fast was the panzer thrust across the Low Countries and into France that Hitler, fearing that they would be cut off, deliberately slowed them down. This frustrated Guderian's objective of crushing the retreating Allied armies before they could reach the sea at Dunkirk. Until the Wehrmacht marched into Paris, the German High Command never fully comprehended the significance of Guderian's mechanized creation. It would be left to another graduate of the Blitzkrieg School, Erwin Rommel, to capture the imagination of the German people and the world, this time in the choking dust of North Africa. Arriving in Tripoli in February 1941 with orders to block British advances against the Italians, Rommel interpreted his instructions loosely. Defensive action was not a concept he understood.
The initial concept was merely economy of force. However, after Rommel showed that he could win victories in Africa and was able to defeat British armies, then, of course, success begat success.
For a period of almost 2 years, the Afrika Korps and the British 8th Army chased each other across 400 miles of barren desert. The campaign more closely resembled naval warfare than traditional European land combat. Leading from the front, Rommel exploited this freedom of maneuver.
Rommel could never sustain his results. He might get all the way to El Alamein, almost to the outskirts of Alexandria in Egypt, and then find himself totally without enough fuel, without enough food, and without enough transport to carry the water and the other things that he needed to sustain a desert war. And the more victories that he won, and the more requests for soldiers and equipment that he sent, the more dire the problem became.
Rommel's ability to outmaneuver and even turn on his pursuers earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. This elusiveness was, to a great extent, attributable to cryptology and excellent radio signal intelligence. Mobile bands listened in on every British transmission from tank-to-tank communications to stationary headquarters. The British were broadcasting in the clear. Rommel, in effect, had a microscope through which to examine the British tactical situation and react accordingly. This accounted for the loss of the British stronghold at Tobruk with its vast stocks of food and fuel. During a battle in July 1942, the British captured the German signal unit. Deprived of his eyes and ears, Rommel never regained the initiative. Outnumbered 3-1, he fought on, but within 8 months, the Germans were totally defeated. What the British learned about radio discipline at the hands of Rommel would evolve into communications security programs adopted by the modern military and used to good effect in another, more recent mechanized war in the desert. Rommel's early victories promoted a myth that the Afrika Korps was an elite volunteer unit specially trained in desert warfare. Members were actually plucked out of the Balkans and deposited in Tripoli with no preparation at all. They were not well suited to the desert, but they were typical German soldiers. Strong, disciplined, and schooled in a command doctrine that proved superior to that of their enemies.
The Germans, particularly in World War II, but throughout German military history, have exemplified a decentralized style of command and control. The junior commanders, the subordinate commanders from platoon leaders on up, understand the commander's intent. They understand the object, the reason, and the importance of the battle. What you have is a thinking, independent commander on the battlefield, not an automaton. That was what the German armies wanted. That's what they trained for years. That was one of the reasons for their great success.
It is tragically ironic that the same command structure that made the Wehrmacht so effective, even under the most desperate conditions, would prolong a war that Germany had little hope of winning.
Command and control will continue in a moment here on A&E.
As the industrial capacity of the United States came increasingly to bear in World War II, the sheer scale of the commitment revolutionized logistics and communications. Men and material fanned out to the far reaches of the globe. The command and control of these forces demanded new capabilities. A multi-channel beltline system was established that could carry a 10-word message around the world in 9.5 seconds. It was the largest military communications network ever developed. In the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, the use of tactical radios enlarged on the German Blitzkrieg experience. Signal Corps personnel were among the first ashore to consolidate beachheads. And in the Far East, the India-China telegraph line stretched 3,000 miles from Calcutta to Kunming. The technical revolution unleashed by hostilities continued unabated after the peace was won. By 1946, the first radar signal had been bounced off the moon in a project called Diana. As wartime cooperation disintegrated, global communism replaced European fascism as a national obsession. Former enemies were enlisted in a race to produce a new generation of weapons and to exploit the possibilities that lay beyond the atmosphere.
This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space.
By 1958, the sound of a human voice beamed by satellite heralded a new era in global communications. As the Cold War deepened, the new technical means would become more significant.
Nuclear weapons added an entirely new and a very troubling dimension to command and control. Our nuclear policies were always 1 or 2 steps ahead of our nuclear command and control capabilities. We were asked to do things that we simply could not do. A strategic nuclear command and control system had a number of unusual characteristics. First of all, it involved the President of the United States, and it had to extend directly to the weapons controller at the lowest possible level. It usually bypassed the military chain of command. It had to be up, mobilized, functioning 24 hours a day.
The management of nuclear forces became, by definition, a special and highly centralized business.
Since the United States policy always was that it would not initiate a strike, the command and control systems had to be sufficiently resilient to a nuclear attack that you could be confident that you could launch the nuclear forces even after receiving some nuclear strikes. And that was very difficult.
The preoccupation with positive control of nuclear forces in the 1960s led to new communications links which were tied into equally new automatic data processing centers. National security issues became reducible to quantifiable data, viewed through the prism of statistics and systems analysis. The techno-revolution in communications and the parade of increasingly complex weapons created a World War I mentality of centralized control. The difference was, the decision-makers in Washington were now on the other end of the wire. When long-simmering guerrilla activity in Vietnam boiled over into full-scale American involvement, expressions like counterinsurgency and low-intensity conflict competed with massive retaliation and controlled response. In 1962, the United States found itself in rice paddies and rainforests, with the tools and disposition to fight a different kind of war.
Vietnam brought several things to light about command and control. It proved that too much can be as great a problem as too little. Communications was everywhere on the battlefield in Vietnam, and that fostered highly centralized control, micromanagement of virtually every aspect of the battle.
As the level of conflict increased, the Washington-based statistics machine developed an insatiable need for information, for data. The resources devoted to communications also grew. The number of channels going to each divisional headquarters increased from 8 in Korea to 32 in Vietnam. In 1965, the Army Communications Facility at Phu Lam was processing 8,000 incoming and outgoing messages every day. By 1967, Phu Lam and another center in Da Nang were processing 1 million messages per month, not including a monthly load of 5 million punched computer cards.
In the Vietnam War, the Army had many excellent examples of superb leadership in battle. It also had some cases where the electronic gadgets were overwhelming the command and control system. Sometimes we had commanders who were in helicopters who could see the overall view, but weren't down at the point with the soldiers and were directing soldiers by helicopter. The problem with that kind of over-centralization is that the guy who's on the ground, who's got to deal with the booby traps and got to deal with the enemy sniper right up in the front, he has to make the decision. And sometimes the guy in the helicopter can't see all that and doesn't understand why all that isn't happening.
Equally frustrating was the impact of over-centralized control on the air war.
You had satellites giving pictures of bombing strikes to the President of the United States, who, with his National Security Advisor, was picking targets and doing bomb damage assessment.
The control of targeting and selection of targets was made in Washington and transmitted out to Vietnam in excruciating detail and with clearly poor results. That is, they could not be responsive to the changing situation in the field, and bomb damage assessment was poorly done and poorly recognized. And of course, this was very confusing. And as you know, there were senior Air Force officers that were court-martialed because they didn't follow those instructions in a manner that was satisfactory to the people in Washington. And in general, it was a very frustrating war for the advocates of air power.
The Vietnam experience indelibly scarred a generation of American military leaders. Some of its lessons would be more quickly applied than others. High-speed communications, a product of nuclear command and control, revolutionized the conduct of conventional regional wars. But this capability could not take the place of an effective strategy.
Communications was everywhere on the battlefield. And we learned from that regardless of the amount of communications, it's never enough. Demand will always exceed capacity.
There was a lot of problem in understanding the limits of command and control, because we were now in an electronic age that allowed the President of the United States to call directly to field commanders in Vietnam. When you try to command from an area 5,000 miles away, could become a problem.
The concepts which we believe are so important now simply were not applied in Vietnam. The selection of targets was based more on political grounds than it was really on military victory, and the unification of the forces just simply was not applied. The policies surrounding the war were different and militarily frustrating.
Command and control will continue in a moment here on A&E.
The detection of Soviet ballistic missiles by U.S. reconnaissance aircraft in October 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. It was as close a failure of deterrence as has ever been experienced. The Cuban Missile Crisis also exposed the vulnerability of existing command and control centers to missile attack and introduced concepts of hardening and survivability. The concern over maintaining command and control became a central issue to the development of strategic nuclear forces.
One of the arguments that for the triad that said the United States needed three separate capabilities had to do with the differences in command and control of the three legs of the triad. So each of the three legs posed a different problem and had different strengths, sea-based always being the most survivable, but perhaps the least strong in command and control. The land-based missiles being the tightest in terms of command and control, but perhaps the most vulnerable of the three legs. The bombers having very specific advantages and disadvantages. Advantages felt by many because they were slow to reach their targets, which meant that they were not a trigger on a nuclear war, but could be launched under warning conditions and recalled and sent on if necessary. So command and control was a very important aspect of the triad and a very important aspect of the differences between the three legs.
EC-135 aircraft called Looking Glass maintained positive control of land-based ballistic missiles and bombers. From February 1961 until July 1990, a looking glass with a general officer on board was always airborne, preventing so-called decapitation in the event of a surprise attack. Reflecting today's diminished threat, Looking Glass maintains a modified standby alert. Ballistic missile submarines present unique challenges for command and control. Long recognized as the most survivable leg of the nuclear triad, the submarine exists within the protective darkness of vast oceans. Boomers, as they are called, are the most autonomous segment of the nuclear retaliatory force. To minimize the chance of detection, boomers don't report in while on patrol. The submarine commander has the flexibility to adjust his patrol location to the presence of threats or possible detection. The Navy relies on low and extremely low frequencies to communicate with submarines patrolling at depth. Transmissions from ground stations are termed bell ringers because they are sent at a predetermined constant rate. Any interruptions of these signals cue the submarine to prepare to receive communications from other sources. These include the E-6 TACAMO aircraft, which is to ballistic missile submarines what Looking Glass is to land-based missiles. TACAMO's mission is to survive a nuclear attack long enough to relay an emergency action message, assuming that ground-based transmitters would not survive a nuclear attack. Orbiting over the ocean, the E-6 deploys two 5-mile-long BLF trailing wire antennas. The wires are weighted so as to hang nearly vertically. While receiving TACAMO's BLF transmissions, the submarine is at its most vulnerable since it has to come closer to the surface. In the event that all communications with command and control links are severed, the submarine crew can fire their weapons without the external enabling codes required by land-based forces. To help assure more positive control of the submarine force, other communications means are under development, including satellites using blue-green lasers which can easily penetrate the water. The ever-increasing accuracy of nuclear weapons led to command and control systems emphasizing what's known as strategic connectivity.
And that brought into being command and control systems that were designed from the top down rather than the bottom up. And from that came things such as the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, a command and control system put into a hardened and ruggedized Boeing 747.
The E-4 kneecap, originally known as the Doomsday Plane, is operated by the Air Force, but it supports what's known as the National Command Authorities, or NCA, consisting of the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. NECAP is the premier airborne command and control center. It is linked to the Pentagon and an alternate national command center in Maryland. Carrying 150,000 pounds of sophisticated electronic gear, the E-4 can talk to any air, sea, or land-based communication system, including satellites and submarines. It can perform all the functions of Looking Glass and TACAMO, as well as tie into civilian telephone and radio networks. The system is hardened, that is, protected against the electromagnetic interference that accompanies thermonuclear detonations. NECAP is within close proximity to designated members of the executive branch and Joint Chiefs at all times. In May 1987, a brand new but unpainted Boeing 747 was flown from the factory in Seattle, Washington to Wichita, Kansas. Over the course of 3 years, it and another 747 would be transformed into Air Force VC-25s, known as Air Force One, when a special passenger is on board. The new presidential plane contains over 239 miles of wire, twice the normal amount of a 747, and can fly over 6,000 miles before it needs to make use of its in-flight refueling capability. 23 crew members and 70 passengers can be carried, including maintenance, medical, and communications personnel. The VC-25 mission communication system includes 85 telephones as well as multi-system radios for normal and satellite communications. Secure voice terminals and cryptographic equipment provide continuous links to the national command centers, including NECAP. As beautiful and self-sufficient as it is, Air Force One is not survivable in a nuclear attack. While multi-million-dollar systems such as NECAP and TACAMO were being designed and built to enhance strategic connectivity, the political ramifications of strife in the so-called Third World would bring about fundamental change to command and control, and the way this country goes to war.
Command and control will continue in a moment here on A&E.
The joyous return of 52 Americans from Iranian captivity in January 1981 would be a significant moment for the U.S. military. Images of an aborted rescue in the Iranian desert had come to represent the failure of a president. But the deaths of 200 defenseless Marines in Lebanon and the uncoordinated, clumsy invasion of Grenada 3 years later would point to fundamental flaws in the military command structure.
The United States Armed Forces don't fight wars. Wars are fought by unified and specified commanders. Commander-in-Chief Europe, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Commander-in-Chief Southern Command. And up until fairly recently, those warfighters had very little say-so about the troops that were assigned to them, the weapons that they brought, the command arrangements, their commanders. That all changed with the Goldwater-Nichols Act, the Defense Reorganization Act of 1986.
For the first time since World War II, the individual services were removed from the operational chain of command. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1989, Saddam Hussein calculated that Americans would have no stomach for a protracted Vietnam-style war. He failed to comprehend U.S. determination never to fight that kind of war again.
The President made it very clear that the authority and responsibility to fight the war was delegated to the commanders in the field. He issued, obviously, the policy guidance and the strategic objectives, but then allowed the war to be fought under the command responsibility of the commanders in the field. The Joint Force Commander, General Schwarzkopf, had a Joint Air Component Commander, General Horner, and he was given the authority to operate the air war.
The instruments of destruction arrayed against Saddam Hussein ranged from Vietnam-era iron bombs to laser and microchip-driven smart weapons. But the real brains of the air campaign was the creation of a joint tasking order for all coalition air forces, the likes of which had never been seen before.
A single air tasking order, one that coordinated the use of all of the air power that existed in the theater, wherever it came from. And this was a marvelous improvement over the situation in Vietnam. Allowed air power to be coordinated, to be integrated, to be allocated in a manner that gave it the best combat effectiveness. And it was, in general, a great success.
It was a war where information was traded off for energy. The better your information, the less firepower, because weapons were precise and accurately delivered. Desert Storm opened the curtain on a new phase of warfare.
The flexible and responsive command structure, once in place, used a variety of technical systems to maintain command and control. The E-3 Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS, has been in service since 1977. Orbiting at an altitude of about 29,000 feet, one AWACS can track as many as 250 planes over a 58,000 square mile area and can relay their positions, headings, and speeds to friendly forces. It can also communicate with national command centers, including NECAP, through satellite. AWACS radar began modernizing in the early 1980s in response to progressively smaller radar signatures of Soviet fighters and cruise missiles. The C-130-based Airborne Command Control Communications, or ABCCC, are airborne battlefield command centers that oversee close air support to ground forces. Originally used in Vietnam and continuously upgraded, ABCCC employs a removable capsule containing 15 consoles for the airborne battle staff.
Last night, on another mission, there was some Special Forces Army that were in trouble in Iraq, behind the enemy lines, and we found out about it. They got F-16s and A-10s to go in and keep the enemy off of the Special Forces team, and then they coordinated for helicopters to come in and pick up the team, and thus saved about 1.5 teams of Special Forces.
The newest airborne command and control system introduced in Operation Desert Storm is the E-8 Joint Stars. The Joint Surveillance and Target Attack Radar System uses sophisticated air-to-ground radar to detect enemy tanks and vehicles, both moving and stationary. It relays this data in real time to air and ground forces. Even though operationally untested, General Schwarzkopf specifically asked for its deployment.
The military is often criticized for failure to bring technology to the battlefield in time. In the case of Joint Stars, it was almost too early. A research and development prototype system was fielded, and in a matter of 2 days on arrival at the battlefield, it was flying missions, giving the commanders in Desert Storm their first real battlefield tactical surveillance capability. It was a pickup crew of Army and Air Force and civilian contractors that made it so effective. It spotted the attack building up before Khafji in Saudi Arabia, characterized the attack. It spotted the exodus from Kuwait city and directed weapons.
New communications technology was equally effective on the ground. Mobile Subscriber Equipment, or MSE, provided secure radio telephone communications for fast-moving mechanized forces. In the space above Desert Storm, satellites played a key role. Scud launches were detected by strategic early warning sensors. And the Navstar Global Positioning System, originally designed for ultra-precise navigation, proved invaluable on the ground.
The Global Positioning Satellite told soldiers where they were on the battlefield, astounded the Iraqis when coalition forces operated with freedom on the desert like Bedouins without roads.
The application of new technology to command and control precision weapons and mobile forces will inevitably continue. But new powers of sight and sound come with certain risks.
Desert Storm operation also proved the vulnerability of command and control, because information was used both as a target and as a weapon. The very first strikes of Desert Storm were against Iraqi command and control, against leadership, and they were astonishingly successful. We'll never know what Saddam Hussein may have had up his sleeve, because he had no means to execute any decisions or commands he might have wanted to. His information structure was literally destroyed in the first few hours of the war.
The command and control technology that we have is really critical to how we fight modern war. But in the final analysis, it's a man making a decision. And it's a commander and his training and his experience that makes the difference in war.
Tomorrow, it was hailed as the savior of the Gulf War, but new evidence may ground it for good. Bill Curtis examines the truth behind the Patriot missile on Investigative Reports. Now stay tuned for A&E's An Evening at the Improv next.